Hello! Welcome to part 2 of Everything I Know About Color Abridged. As always, I am your ambiguously knowledgeable host, Nathan, and last time in part 1, we talked about linear color and the first source of nonlinear color in images, and that is transfer functions, which we do on purpose for encoding efficiency. And in this part, I want to talk about sensor noise. But while preparing this part of the series, I realized that probably we want to cover that in a slightly broader context. So I'm not just going to be talking about sensor noise, although that will still make up the bulk of this video, but more broadly, I'm going to be speaking about non-zero black levels. However, before we get started, I do want to put in a quick disclaimer up front here that this video contains some of the material that I myself am shakiest on in this series. I've tried to avoid going in depth into things that I'm not confident about, and I believe the information here is overall good, but I just want to make sure that I'm not projecting too much false confidence here. Anyway, so with that in mind, let's get started. As a quick recap of the previous video, when we first bring in our footage, it has often been encoded with a non-linear transfer function. So to decode back into linear color, we need to apply the inverse transfer function, and then we're back in linear color. What I did not mention or discuss in the previous video is that even after doing that, we can still end up in a situation that looks like this, where our black level, our zero energy black level, is actually now represented by a small positive number. Additionally, some transfer functions actually try to compensate for this themselves. They've pre-estimated some non-zero black level that they expect, and they try to subtract that out. But if they overestimate that, then they can actually end us up with a negative number black level, which is also not great. You end up with these crushed blacks. So both of those situations are not great, and both of them are something that we need to compensate for to actually get back to a proper linear color representation where zero actually represents zero energy black. But to do that properly, we're going to want to have some understanding of the causes, the sources of these non-zero black levels. So I'm going to be covering 3 that I think are particularly important to have at least some knowledge of. The first is, of course, sensor noise. The second is broadcast legal ranges, which also goes by the terms broadcast safe ranges, broadcast legal color, broadcast safe color. I think some people even say limited color. It goes by a bunch of different names, but they're all referring to the same thing. And then finally, I'm also going to be talking about lens flare, which I think is pretty straightforward, but I still want to touch on it briefly. So let's get started with sensor noise. So last time we talked about this chord here and how it's not perfect, but we still left the camera and the display as being perfect. So let's start chipping away at that now. We're still going to leave the display as perfect for now, but we're going to chip away at the camera and bring this guy a little bit more down to reality. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the camera sensor, because the camera sensor itself inside the camera is also obviously not perfect. The image data that you get from it is noisy. It's not pristine. And there are a variety of causes of this noise, which is itself a fascinating rabbit hole to dive down. But we don't actually need that rabbit hole to talk about how noise affects black levels. So for the sake of time, and because I frankly don't know enough about that rabbit hole to avoid accidentally spreading misinformation, I'm instead going to broadly categorize sensor noise into 2 different kinds of noise. The first is what I'm going to call proportional noise, and the second is additive noise. Both of these types of noise are present in the image data that we get back from image sensors. But the reason that I've split it into these 2 categories is because proportional noise does not affect black levels, whereas additive noise does. And to give a little bit of intuition about what I mean by these 2 types of image noise, I've created this low resolution image with the hope that the noise that I'm about to show you will make it through video compression. And this is the smooth, perfect, pristine version of the image that we would get from a theoretical perfect image sensor. And this is proportional noise. And what distinguishes proportional noise is that, for example, in this black area up here, there is no noise. right? And in these dark areas, there's less noise. And kind of the brighter the area of the image, the more noise shows up. And I think it's relatively straightforward to see why this doesn't affect our black levels, because by definition, this noise doesn't exist in black areas. It needs some kind of actual image signal from the light hitting the sensor to get noisy in the first place. This, on the other hand, is additive noise, and additive noise definitely shows up in your blacks. And additive noise basically behaves as if you had an image of just pure noise, and you literally just laid that on top of your pristine image and just added the RGB values of corresponding pixels together. And this obviously affects our black levels. You can imagine, for example, that if we put this image through a denoiser, this area that's supposed to be black would actually get smoothed out to like a dark gray. So our goal is to take this additional added noise energy and subtract it back out from our image to restore our black levels. But noise is random and varies from frame to frame. So there's no perfect way to do this that would actually give us a pristine image. And in fact, this is the first problem of many problems we're going to face in this series where there is no single objectively correct solution. Instead, there are a range of solutions with different trade-offs. And to start exploring some of those solutions and their trade-offs, I want to introduce a simplified model of how camera sensors work. So this grid represents a very low-resolution camera sensor, with each of these squares being a photosite, or basically a pixel. And the basic principle that camera sensors operate on is not that different from solar panels. You can imagine that each of these photosites is basically a little solar panel, and the more light that hits it, that shines on it, the more of an electrical charge it generates. And then from those electrical charges, we can create an image. Now let's focus on just one of these rows of photosites. So here are those photosites, that row, and then below them I have this graph here representing the amount of electrical signal that each of these photosites generates. Right now, this is representing a perfect image sensor, where the electrical signal from each photosite is due entirely to the actual light hitting that photosite. But that's not very realistic. So let's make this more realistic now and add in our sensor noise. I'm representing the portion of the electrical signal due to light with green bars, and I'm representing the part due to noise, due to sensor noise, with red. Let's zoom in on our noise a little bit to get a closer look, and this noise has a lower bound, an upper bound, and an average level. And these three levels are going to give us three different solutions to this problem with different trade-offs. The solution for the upper bound is going to be to subtract that upper bound level from the signal. The solution for the average level is going to be to subtract the average level from the signal. And as you can probably guess, the solution for the lower bound is going to be to subtract the lower bound level from the signal. Now, the lower bound of your noise is usually already going to be at 0, and subtracting 0 is doing nothing. So you might wonder why I'm including that as one of the possible solutions. Well, there are two reasons. The first is that there may be other sources of non-zero black levels, such as broadcast legal ranges, and this is actually a great way to address those issues, even if you don't care about sensor noise itself. The second reason is that unlike subtracting the average or upper bound, subtracting the lower bound will never result in negative color values. And so you get to sidestep the whole issue of how to handle those negative values. The big downside of this solution, of course, is that you're not actually addressing the non-zero black levels of the sensor noise. But if your noise levels are really low, that may not be an issue. So this is a good solution to have in your back pocket for whenever the noise levels are low enough that you don't have to care about them. The next solution is to subtract the upper bound of the noise. And this solution has the advantage that if a color is supposed to be black, it will definitely show up as black after subtracting the upper bound. The downside is that it's actually overestimating your black level, and it's going to end up pushing your dark colors to be darker than they should be, which we can see if I flip between this and the version from our perfect image sensor. So basically, the only time you want to use this solution is when you care so much about your blacks that you're willing to sacrifice the other dark colors in your image. And I can't think of any pre-color grading situation where that would be the case. So in other words, I don't recommend ever actually using this solution, but I did want to cover it for completeness. The last solution I'm going to cover, and the solution that I personally like best, is to subtract the average noise level. And the reason I like this solution is because it puts the statistically correct black level at 0. Since we're dealing with random noise, this is really the best that we can do. It does have the disadvantage that it can create negative color values in our darkest colors, so it still isn't suitable for situations where that isn't acceptable for one reason or another. But otherwise, this solution is awesome. And to get a sense of why, let's flip between this and our perfect image sensor again. By subtracting the average noise level, we've created an image where the noise is fluctuating around the correct color value. So even though any given single pixel on any given single frame will still be wrong, it overall gives us the correct color levels. Another reason that I like this approach is because of how it interacts with color noise. So this, of course, is a black and white sensor, which is not generally what we're shooting footage with. Usually we're shooting with a color sensor like this. And color sensors generally have 3 different types of photosites. They have red, green, and blue photosites. And each of those 3 photosites have independent noise from each other. And so the final color that they make up actually fluctuates not just in terms of luminance, but also in terms of hue and saturation. And in general, that's not any more of a problem than luminance fluctuations. But most camera sensors, for reasons that I may touch on later in the series, don't have even noise levels across the different channels like this. Usually, they have more noise in the red and blue channels than in the green channel, like this. And the end result of this is that particularly in the darker colors, the noise is now effectively tinting our colors magenta or purple, because on average, they're adding more energy to the red and blue channels than the green channel. But if we subtract the average noise level of each channel, then in addition to addressing the black level, it also normalizes this difference between the channels, and then we're fluctuating around the correct color again. Importantly, we don't want to subtract the combined average noise level of all the channels together, because if we do that, it actually makes the problem worse, because it's effectively overestimating the noise level of the green channel relative to the other channels. So you want to make sure that you're actually subtracting the average red noise level and the average green noise level and so on from each respective channel. So to recap, we have 3 broad approaches to addressing the non-zero black levels introduced by sensor noise. The first is subtracting the upper bound of the noise, which I definitely don't recommend. Second is subtracting the average noise level, ideally separately for each channel. This is my favorite approach and is statistically correct, but can create negative color values. And third is subtracting the lower bound of the noise, which doesn't actually address the effects of the noise itself, but is a handy way to address certain other sources of non-zero black levels. There is one other approach that I want to briefly mention, which is adding to the channels to get their average levels to be the same. This doesn't address black levels at all, but it does make the colors in your darks closer to what they should be without introducing any negative color values. And I basically think of this as subtracting the lower bound plus. Now, some of you may be thinking, quite understandably, well, Nathan, that's all well and good, but how on earth do we find these upper, average, and lower bounds of the sensor noise? And the answer is something called a dark image. And a dark image is simply a picture that you take without letting any actual light get to the sensor. So for example, I usually use a lens cap. I just put the lens cap on the camera and take a picture that way. But any way of taking a picture that keeps light physically from getting to the sensor will work. And the resulting image will contain all of your additive sensor noise. And then you can, for example, take the average color of all the pixels in the image, and that'll give you a really good estimate of your average noise level for those camera settings. So that's about all I want to cover about sensor noise, aside from what is probably going to be a boatload of footnotes at the end of the video. But now let's move on to just a quick overview of broadcast legal ranges. I'm not going to go super deep into this because there's still aspects of like the origins of this that I'm not super sure about, but I do want to cover at least the current state of things and how that can affect black levels. So let's jump right into that. Some of you may recognize this device. It is an analog CRT television, much like the one that I grew up with, and back in those days, television was broadcast exclusively in analog, not in digital. Now, analog television transmission is a bit outside of my wheelhouse, so take this next bit with a grain of salt, but here is the gist as best I've been able to piece it together. So analog television signals only use a part of the total signal range for color data, because other parts of the same signal have to be used for other information. In particular, this lower area is used for synchronization data, and this upper area can interfere with audio, which is encoded in a different way and isn't visible in this graph. Anyway, the details of this aren't super important. The point is that there is this limited range of values that can be used for color information. So this lower level here represents black, and this upper level here represents maximum luminance. So that's analog, but eventually we of course moved on to digital. And in computers, we use the full range of values, in the case of 8-bit color from 0 to 255, but digital television, with its heritage of analog broadcasting, adopted this idea of a limited range of usable values, and this is called the broadcast legal range. So instead of 0 representing black, now this higher level represents black. So to get broadcast encoded footage back into linear color, where black is represented by 0, we need to subtract back out this non-zero black level. Simple, right? And yeah, it pretty much is. And this is broadcast legal ranges in a nutshell. But there are a few complicating factors that are worth being aware of. First, broadcast legal ranges are a display-oriented standard, which means that this black level doesn't necessarily represent zero energy black as captured by the camera. It just represents what should be displayed as black on a television, which is pretty subjective. Second, even though only this range is treated as valid color data by televisions, there is a larger but still not full range where values are allowed, and televisions simply clip them to black and white respectively when displaying them. These 2 points together means that it's ambiguous which encoded values represent which color levels. You might hope, for example, that this broadcast black level represents zero energy black, or the sensor's lower bound, or really any other precise color level we could rely on, but there's no guarantee of that. Any precise level you might want to rely on can be either above or below this level because this is a subjective black. To even further complicate things, some camera manufacturers incorporate broadcast legal ranges directly into their transfer functions. For example, if we take a look at the transfer functions from the previous video, you may recall that some of them have these negative values. Well, these negative values are the broadcast legal ranges baked into the curves. So when you encode and decode colors with them, they're automatically squeezed into and pulled out of the broadcast legal range. And as a brief aside, it's worth noting that both of these curves with the broadcast legal ranges baked into them are log transfer functions. And I'm not aware of any situation in which you would want to directly broadcast color data from a log encoded video file. So why they've incorporated these broadcast legal ranges into their log transfer functions, I I have no idea. That would be a fun thing to ask these camera manufacturers. But anyway, the point is that not only do you have to be aware of whether your footage is encoded with broadcast legal ranges or not, you also have to be aware of whether the relevant transfer function has them baked in or not. As a quick case study of how all of this can combine to become really awful, here is a zoomed-in crop of an image, and this is the original log-encoded version straight from the camera, which, as expected, looks washed out. And here it is after applying the manufacturer's official LUT for that log transfer function, and you'll notice that the blacks have been crushed pretty badly. For comparison, here it is linearized by a custom LUT that uses the sensor's average noise level to set the black level. What's happening here is that the actual zero energy black level of the image is lower than the broadcast black level baked into the official LUT, and so the LUT is overcompensating and subtracting too much. And the point is that it's really easy to unwittingly end up in situations like this, so in practice you might not want to rely on the black levels baked into your camera's official LUTs. Fortunately, you don't have to. You can instead snap some dark images and use those to determine the correct black level. Of course, ideally, your camera manufacturer provides LUTs that give you reliably good results, and if that's the case, go right ahead and use them, but I recommend being at least a little bit wary and verifying yourself. So that wraps it up for broadcast legal ranges, and next up is lens flare. But I do want to say up front that I actually have a slightly ulterior reason for talking about lens flare, which I will get to pretty quick. But first, let's just jump right in and talk about how it can affect your black levels. So here's a picture with a really strong lens flare in it, and that flare from the sun peeking through the trees contributes to the brightness of pixels way beyond the sun itself, which we can see if we block the sun. Now, most people probably wouldn't call this raised black levels because the lens flare is itself an obvious part of the image. However, it's not just bright lights that cause lens flare. Literally all light entering the lens causes flares, they're just a lot dimmer. So, for example, in this image, the sky is also creating dim flares, which, when added up together, create a kind of general haze over the image, slightly raising the overall black levels. Of course, you could argue that even this is a real part of the image as well, not black levels per se, and that's a totally valid argument, and in fact brings me to the real reason I wanted to discuss lens flare, which is to point out that what you consider a real part of the image or not depends on what you're using it for and what you consider desirable. For example, if we look at an image intended for building an HDRI, suddenly our attitude towards lens flare changes quite dramatically, because this lens flare is clearly not desirable when what we're trying to measure is the actual lighting present at the scene. In this context, the lens flare is an artifact, not a part of the image we're trying to capture, and it absolutely can be thought of as raising the black levels in these areas of the image. Now, I'm using lens flare to make this point because it's the most obvious case of this kind of context-dependent desirability, but really, this applies to everything. For example, even sensor noise can be considered desirable if it's artistically important to the filmmaker. It really does depend on use case and intention. And what this really comes down to is something that I mentioned in the footnotes of the last video, which is that there are different kinds of linear color, and that includes black levels. There are actually multiple different black levels. We, of course, have display black levels for the final finished film, and those are an artistic choice, but even when we're just talking about black levels in captured footage, we still have multiple different black levels which are relevant to different use cases. For example, we have a zero electrical energy black for the raw electrical signal of the sensor. We have a sensor zero light energy black for the light energy hitting the sensor, and we have a scene zero light energy black for the actual light coming at the camera from the scene before it even passes through the lens. And there are even more black levels you could put up here by making finer distinctions and accounting for more and more things, but the point I'm trying to make here is that the black level you care about and the kind of linear color you care about is going to depend on what you're doing. For example, when taking photos for HDRIs and textures, the relevant black level is the scene zero light energy black because you don't want lens flares there, because you're trying to measure the actual light reflected off of the surfaces. But when you're integrating VFX, you may actually need to be aware of multiple black levels depending on the pipeline. For example, integrated elements should match their black levels to the scene zero light energy black, but the director may want to preserve the noise and lens flare in the footage itself, so you might be working with footage that has its black level at the zero electrical energy black. So it can be kind of obnoxious to keep all of this in mind, and depending on your pipeline and how much you care about the various aspects of this, you can probably get away with ignoring some of it, but I just want to make sure that you are at least aware of these issues around black levels and linear color, so that you can make informed decisions about how you approach things. So that wraps up the main video, but of course I also have footnotes, and boy do I have footnotes this time. So my first set of footnotes are basically just a reminder that many of the things I presented in this video are heavily simplified for the sake of focusing on the main topic of black levels. The worst offenders of that were, first, the simplified model of camera sensors that I presented with that solar panel analogy. In fact, this is probably the biggest sin I made in this video, and I do feel a little bit guilty about it. It's a fine mental model for talking about certain aspects of camera sensors, and I will likely be reusing it in the future for that reason, but it breaks down really quickly when you start looking into things like dynamic range, or do a deeper dive into sensor noise than I presented here. Second was my simplification of a variety of things about sensor noise, both how I simplified noise into two broad categories and how I discussed the upper and lower bounds of noise are significant simplifications of the statistics of noise. And last, I was really hand-wavy about the link between broadcast legal ranges in analog and digital video. In reality, I'm not actually sure that the legal ranges in digital video have anything to do with analog video. I do still think it's a good mental anchor, so to speak, which is why I presented it that way, but I have yet to find any primary sources that explicitly state the real purpose of digital legal ranges. So if anyone does know, I would love to hear from you. Even better if you can point me at primary sources, because I'm really curious. So my next set of footnotes are about sensor noise. First, I want to emphasize that compensating for sensor noise isn't always necessary, particularly if your noise levels are low enough to not be noticeable. In fact, this just generally applies to all kinds of color processing. If you can get away with not doing it, then no worries. Second, noise level subtraction, like I described in this video, should technically be done on raw sensor data, not on RGB values. So if you shoot in RAW, you can do it correctly, but once you're in an RGB color space defined by RGB primaries, noise level subtraction is technically incorrect. Understanding why that's the case requires topics that I'm going to be covering later in the series, so I'm not going to break that down here, but I just wanted to make sure that people are aware. Now, having said that, even in RGB, noise level subtraction is still worth doing, in my opinion, when it's needed. Incorrect in this case doesn't mean bad, it just means not quite as good. Third, sensor noise is, of course, affected by camera settings, and I think most people are already aware of this, but I just wanted to make this explicit. So you can't just take a single dark image and call it good for all future footage. You need different noise estimates for different camera settings and shooting conditions. The technically perfect thing to do here would be to take a dark image before every shot and estimate things on a per shot basis, but that's probably overkill if you're doing everything manually. Unfortunately, I don't have any really great advice about this, but I will say that my current approach is to just use a handful of estimates based on the camera settings I use most often and which settings seem to affect noise the most on that camera. And last, I mentioned that average noise level subtraction can result in negative color values, but I didn't discuss how to handle those values. So the technically correct thing to do is to preserve those values throughout your entire VFX pipeline, but that can be really difficult, and sometimes it's not even clear how that should be done. Moreover, even if there is a clear way to do it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the software you use supports it. So in practice, it's generally fine to just clip these negative color values to 0. Doing so does mean that your very darkest colors won't quite be fluctuating around the right color anymore, but all the other colors still will be, and even for the very dark colors, it's still closer than not doing anything at all. My third set of footnotes, which is actually just one footnote, is about lens flare. So I talked about when you might want to compensate for lens flare or not, but I didn't discuss how you could do so. And the reason for that is because I don't have a good answer. I guess if your shot is stationary and so is all of the lighting, then snapping a shot of like an object with a small, very dark hole in it to get a reference black could work. But if the camera is moving, then the light getting into the lens will also be changing, and all bets are off. A much better approach is just to try to avoid the flare in the first place by using lenses that minimize flare, or if you're shooting HDRIs, masking out especially bright lights in some of your photos and manually stitching them together later, stuff like that. But really, I wish I had better advice about this, but it's a tricky problem, and it's not one that I've really gotten very deep into yet. And finally, my last footnote is about broadcast legal ranges. I made fun of log transfer functions baking in broadcast legal ranges, but this wasn't totally fair. For example, log footage from Arri Alexa cameras also encodes black with a small non-zero value, and they have a really good reason for it. They do it so that they can effectively do average noise level subtraction for you and put the statistically correct sensor black at that raised black level, leaving room for the negative color values. And that's a great idea. But there's a significant difference between what Arri is doing and what the anonymous camera manufacturer I demoed with does. First, Arri isn't actually using broadcast legal ranges. For example, they use the full range of upper values, and they don't limit themselves to even the larger allowed range of the broadcast legal range. Second, Arri is, at least if I understand their white paper correctly, taking care to put the statistically correct black at that black level so that you can rely on it. Neither of those two things are true of the camera and transfer function in the demo I gave, so it's still not at all clear why they are using broadcast legal ranges. So, at least for now, I will continue to make fun of camera manufacturers that use actual broadcast legal ranges in their log transfer functions, especially when they do it poorly. And if I sound salty about this, it's because I am. And that's it for part 2. You now know pretty much everything about linear color that I do. In part 3, we're going to start actually talking about color. Wait, what? Yes, that is right. We haven't really been talking about color yet. These first 2 videos have just been about handling annoying practical details of getting color data into a linear representation, but I haven't said anything about what that color data actually means. So from here on out, things are going to get pretty weird. So yeah, how's that for a cliffhanger?